In the first day of debates, the member countries of the United Nations demanded the United States to lift the economic blockade it has imposed in Cuba for more than 60 years and that the Caribbean nation be excluded from the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. In Palestine, the displaced people settled inside a stadium outside the city of Gaza due to the ongoing Israeli bombardment of the so-called safe zones. 8 days before the presidential elections in the United States, the candidates are intensifying their campaign events to get the undecided vote in key states. Hello and welcome to From the South. I'm Alejandra Garcia from TeleSUR studios in Caracas, Venezuela. We begin with the news. Stay with us. On the first day of debates, the member countries of the United Nations demanded the United States to lift the economic blockade it has imposed in Cuba for more than 60 years and that the Caribbean nation be excluded from the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. During the day, several member blocs, such as the non-aligned countries groups of friends in defense of the United Nations Charter, CELAC, CARICOM, the African Group, and G77 plus China, underlined that the U.S. blockade is the major obstacle that Cuba faces in its efforts to achieve its development goals. The non-aligned movement expressed its concern regarding the impact of the blockade on the livelihood of the Cuban people, while CARICOM urged the U.S. to take measures to rebuild relations with the Caribbean island to strengthen multilateralism. The permanent representative of Singapore on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations remembered that the General Assembly adopted the resolution offending the embargo 31 times before. The diplomat later highlighted the negative impact of the blockade on ordinary Cuban people.
The General Assembly has adopted this resolution 31 times by an overwhelming majority since 1992. Each year, nearly all UN member states vote in favor of the resolution. This reflects the international community's strong support for the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, namely sovereign equality, non-interference, non-intervention, and the settlement of disputes by peaceful means to preserve international peace and security and justice. This has affected the trajectory of sustainable development across the board in Cuba and negatively impacted the lives of ordinary Cuban people. The US embargo has cost Cuba over $164 billion at current prices. From March 2023 to February 2024 alone, the blockade cost Cuba over $5 billion in losses.
The Iraqi permanent representative on behalf of the G77 and China spoke out against the U.S. blockade imposed in Cuba and its extraterritorial policies, noting they all violate the right to trade freely of all nations.
We are deeply concerned about the widening of the extraterritorial nature of the embargo on Cuba, notably through the full implementation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. The application of this law is a clear transgression to the freedom of commerce among nations because of its intimidating purpose by punishing any trade or investment transactions between any given country and Cuba.
In this context, the permanent representative of Venezuela to the United Nations, Samuel Moncada, stressed the hardship of the Cuban people as a result of the U.S. coercive policies.
Embargo against Cuba constitutes a massive violation of the human rights of its people. No Cuban family escapes its impacts. This was particularly clear in recent days when the power grid of this sisterly nation was seriously damaged, leaving entire families without electricity for days. This is a direct consequence of the embargo that was celebrated on social media by US representatives, recognizing their responsibility for a clearly criminal policy.
Likewise, in this context, PhD Deputy Permanent Representative of the Philippines to the United Nations, Leila Lora Santos, stressed the urgent need to immediately lift the U.S. blockade against Cuba, as it has been a global claim for 30 years.
The Philippines aligns itself fully with the statements delivered by Singapore on behalf of ASEAN, Uganda on behalf of NAM, and Iraq on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. The Philippines supports the implementation of General Assembly Resolution 787 on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo by the U.S. against Cuba. The report of the Secretary General clearly shows that the international community once again strongly supports an end to the six-decade embargo, an unjust and unjustified sanctions policy.
In addition, the permanent representative of Mexico to the United Nations, Enrique Vasconcelos y Cruz, reaffirmed his nation's support to Cuba, highlighting they will continue cooperating in all areas with the nation.
Once again, we express our firm support for Cuba, a country with which Mexico will continue to work in order to overcome the joint challenges that we face, and do this through cooperation, dialogue, and regional integration, as we proved in recent days by offering all of the help that we could to Cuba after the electric crisis, the grid crisis that turned out the lights on the island for several days.
Let's take a short break, but remember you can join us on TikTok at TeleSUR English, where you'll find news in different formats, news updates, and more. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. In Palestine, the displaced people settled inside a stadium outside the city of Gaza due to the ongoing Israeli bombardment of the so-called safe zones. The refugees expressed their discomfort due to the precarious conditions they are living in and their fear of the coming winter after the intensification of the Tel Aviv offensive against the towns of Avelia, Beit Lahia, and others in the north of the Gaza Strip. Thousands of Palestinian families were forced to move again. According to local media, the Israeli occupation army intensified its siege of the northern Gaza Strip in early September and launched a campaign to limit the delivery of humanitarian aid to Palestinians. In Palestine, the Israeli army attacked on Tuesday a group of international observers, including the former mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, and the European deputy Jaume Essens. Local media confirmed that the entire delegation is safe after the event took place around 9 a.m. local time. According to the information, the observers were accompanying a group of Palestinian farmers while they were picking olives in the occupied West Bank. According to the former mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, the Israeli occupation forces attacked without exchanging words with the delegation nor with the Palestinian citizens. In Iran, Foreign Minister Sayed Abbas Araghchi demanded the United Nations Security Council to impose sanctions on Israel for the massacre of civilians in Gaza and Lebanon and its military interference in the area. During a meeting with the ambassador of foreign countries in Tehran, the Iranian diplomat warned that the Tel Aviv regime is threatening the peace and security of Middle Eastern nations with its war actions against the people. He also emphasized that the United Nations Security Council must act against the insistence of the Zionist regime to continue the war and prevent more innocent bloodshed in Gaza and Lebanon. In this regard, he called on the international community to take immediate and collective action against the flagrant violations of international law committed by Israel. On related topics, also in the United Nations, during a meeting of the Security Council, Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, Samir Saed Irvani, pointed out that the Israeli attacks on Iran are a flagrant violation of international law and the United Nations Charter.
Condemn Israeli aggression in the strongest possible terms. Israel's hostile action are a blatant and dangerous breach of international law and the UN Charter, particularly the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity and prohibition on threats or the use of force against the sovereignty of states. These principles are not merely abstract ideals, they are foundational pillars upon which the international peace and stability rely.
The Iranian representative accused the United States of being an accomplice of the Israeli regime in the genocide perpetrated against the peoples of Palestine and Lebanon.
United States' involvement in Israeli aggression through its provision of technical expertise and advanced military system to Israel has further instigated and emboldened Israel to conduct its aggressive attack against Iran. Therefore, the U.S. government is complicit in Israeli aggression and will bear its consequences. Furthermore, the United States has already been complicit in the ongoing war crimes and genocidal campaign targeting civilian and civilian infrastructure both in Gaza and Lebanon. The vast majority of bombs Israeli drops on Gaza and Lebanon are U.S.
Two pro-Palestinian activists were interrogated on Tuesday by a court in Spain for showing their support to the Palestinian people after the aggressions perpetrated by the Israeli regime. Both defenders of the Palestinian people are being investigated for crimes of glorification of terrorism for their alleged support to the Palestinian resistance during the event Defense of Palestine and Criminalization in Europe held in the Spanish Congress on June 3, 2024. Both women were denounced by the political party Vox, which assures that all expressions in favor of Palestine represent a support to terrorism. In this sense, the international organization denounced that these declarations limit freedom of expression, make the struggle of the Palestinian people invisible, and trigger a criminal persecution against those who defend the freedom and independence of the State of Palestine. In China, local press announced on Tuesday that Wang Haose, the only women spaceflight engineer in part of the Shenzhou 19 mission, which will take off on Wednesday, the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center in northwest of the country. The mission, made up of 3 astronauts, will lift off at 4:27 a.m. local time on Wednesday, heading for Tiangong Space Station, located around 450 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Authorities reported that the team will return to Earth in late April or early May 2025, while the crew that is now aboard the Tiangong Space Station is expected to come back to Earth on November 4th after completing handover procedures with the incoming astronauts. Regarding spaceflight engineer Haose, the deputy director of the China Manned Space Agency, remarked her preparation. Let's listen.
Before being selected, Wang Haose was a senior engineer at the Academy of Aerospace Liquid Propulsion Technology of the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. She is currently the only female aerospace flight engineer in China and will also be the 3rd woman in China to carry out manned spaceflight missions.
Russia launches ballistic and cruise missiles as part of the nuclear deterrence exercise to prepare to respond to a similar future attack by an enemy. The Russian Defense Ministry reported that during the strategic exercise, an intercontinental ballistic missile was launched and the strategic nuclear missile submarine of the Russian Pacific Fleet was put into operation. At the same time, several long-range aircrafts were part of the exercise by launching cruise missiles in the air, all of them hitting their targets. President Vladimir Putin stated that the use of nuclear weapons is a measure of last resort to ensure the security of the country and that Moscow won't be dragged into an arms race.
I would like to point out that Russia confirms its fundamental position on the use of nuclear weapons as an extremely exceptional measure to ensure the security of the state. At the same time, we are fully aware that the nuclear triad remains a reliable guarantor of the sovereignty and security of our country, and allows us to solve the problems of strategic deterrence, as well as to maintain nuclear parity and the balance of power in the world as an essential element of global stability.
Vladimir Putin stressed that in the face of current geopolitical tensions, Russia will maintain its nuclear forces at the necessary level of sufficiency.
In view of increasing geopolitical tensions and the emergence of new external threats and risks, it is important to have modern strategic forces that are always ready for combat. We will continue to improve all its components. We have the resources to do so. I emphasize that we will not engage in a new arms race, but we will maintain nuclear forces at the necessary level of sufficiency.
We have a second short break coming up, but before we invite you to visit our YouTube channel at TeleSUR English, there you'll be able to rewatch our interviews, top stories, special broadcastings and more. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell to stay up to date on the world's most recent events. Fine, a short break, don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. 8 days before the presidential elections in the United States, the candidates are intensifying their campaign events to get the undecided vote in key states. Democrat Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump are in the final stretch of their election campaigns and in the battle to win votes with only 1 week to go before the presidential election, which will be held on Tuesday, November 5th. Kamala Harris describes her campaign closing as the final play against the Republican candidate, while Trump returned to Pennsylvania, one of the 7 states that will be called to tip the balance. According to experts, states such as Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, among others, could change the results of the election due to the large number of undecided citizens in these states. In this context, Donald Trump is holding on Tuesday a rally in Allentown, Pennsylvania, located about 60 miles northwest of Philadelphia. The former president is looking to notch a victory in the Keystone State after he won Pennsylvania in the 2016 presidential election but lost in the 2020 election. On the other hand, Kamala Harris is in the nation's capital. She is delivering a closing argument for her campaign at the Ellipse, the same spot where Trump gave a fiery speech nearly 4 years ago before a crowd of his supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. The governments of Vietnam and Venezuela strengthen cooperation with new investment agreements of mutual interest. This Tuesday, Venezuela's Executive Vice President Delcy Rodriguez met with the President of Vietnam, Luong Quon, during her official visit to the Asian country with the purpose of strengthening relations between both nations. The meeting took place in Vietnam at the Presidential Hall, where topics such as investment, oil, agriculture, and telecommunications were discussed. On the other hand, the Vice President of Venezuela is expected to address issues related to investment in the areas of health, culture, among others, within the framework of the 35 years of historical relations between both countries. The Argentinian State Workers Association began a new national strike on Tuesday in rejection of the worsening of the economic crisis during the presidential administration of Javier Milei. During the mobilization, the workers' union demanded the national government to reinstate those public administration employees who were unfairly dismissed by the executive. Likewise, the State Workers Association recalled that over 75% of the state workers receive incomes below the poverty line, and those who work in the provinces and municipalities of the country are the most affected. The protest will continue in the city of Buenos Aires until this Wednesday, October 30, to coincide with the general transport strike scheduled for the same date. In Ecuador, the government announced its intention to negotiate the purchase of energy from Colombia in the midst of the worsening crisis the energy sector is facing in the country. The president of the Energy Chamber, Roberto Aspiazu, declared to the press that a private Colombian company offered some 200 megawatts to alleviate the problem nationwide. He also reiterated that although the flow of the rivers that feed the hydroelectric plants has increased with the recent rains, the solution to the energy crisis will depend on the contracting, renting, or purchase of energy. At the same time, the President Daniel Noboa informed that he will travel to Colombia to attend the COP16 session and to meet with President Gustavo Petro to discuss the reestablishment of their commercial agreements on energy matters. We have come to the end of this news brief, but you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net and join us on social media. We are on Facebook, X, Instagram, Telegram, and TikTok as well. For TeleSUR English, I'm Alejandra Garcia. Thank you for watching.